academic content.
That's actually a very helpful example that you gave about math in terms of subtraction and tradition. So for our teachers who actually want to improve their classroom practices in the implementation of MTB MLE here in the Philippines, what do you think are the basic principles that they can employ in terms of enabling their students to master their first language?
Well, allowing conversation in the classroom in the first language so that kids are talking about what they're learning. So whether it's photosynthesis or division or whatever the content of the lesson is, talking about that lesson in the first language will help them to learn the content, and then they can start talking about it in the second language when they have that second language there. Some teachers often say that, you know, we can't teach those concepts in the first language because the academic content is missing in the first language. Like, we don't have a word for synthesis. We don't have a word for multiplication. But in actuality, when you're first introducing those concepts, we don't say, this is it. First, we talk about the concept. We explain what it means to add things together, numbers together, and this is the result. And we talk about what it is, and we use manipulatives to show what it is. And then after the concept is there, then we can apply the label. You know, we call this process addition, or we call this process photosynthesis, and then we can add those academic terminology. But just saying that we lack the academic terminology isn't an appropriate excuse not to use the first language. And so by talking about the academic processes, content that they're learning in the first language, that helps build the second language. And also through reading and writing in the first language. You know, research says we only learn to read once.
That's right.
So when we learn to read the first language, because we're reading words that we're familiar with and we use every day, it's much easier to facilitate comprehension of what we read. But when we read in a second language, all of those words we don't have in our everyday vocabulary.
Right.
And so how are we going to understand what we read? So it doesn't help to facilitate good reading comprehension when we start in the second language. Children can easily learn to decode, but understanding what they're reading is crucial to learning the content of what they're reading, and that only happens when the language has already been built and they already use those words in print, in everyday conversation. So talking about and doing group work where we discuss things, and then of course reading and writing in the first language first, facilitate learning academic content.
Yeah. In your example, okay. It's the noise outside. I shouldn't have used that term. Huwag naman sila magbabags. Okay, rolling. 1, 2, 3, rolling. Rian, you mentioned earlier the use of manipulatives in teaching MLE. What exactly are manipulatives?
Well, that means something that we can touch and we can use to explore concepts. So for example, oftentimes when teachers teach addition or subtraction, they will just write numbers and the plus and the equal signs on the chalkboard.
That's how I remember.
Right, but those are scratches on the board, right? And children know their numbers. But what we need for them to understand that process is to hold things in their hands where they have 2 here and then they have 2 here and then they put them together and count them. So manipulatives are physical objects that we use to discover things. So for science, it's also, you know, holding and examining leaves and water and stones and whatever it is that we're talking about. So it's not just words or abstract concepts, but we start with something as concrete as possible. And then we say, okay, when we have 2 marbles in this hand and your friend has 3 marbles and we put them together, we have 5, then we teach how to represent that in written form, which is the abstract form of the physical action.
Well, you've already given us some tips on how to teach MLE and the strategies that you mentioned. I think are going to be very helpful. But what other classroom strategies would you suggest to foster mastery of a first language?
Reading and writing are both crucial. So when we read, we get meaning from what we're reading, but also the process of reading teaches us to think abstractly as well. But it also, we can use that to introduce new vocabulary. Remember, we said that 5 and 6 year olds, for any learner, they're fluent in their mother tongue for their age level, but we want to develop that fluency as they go through school, and not just leaving it to the home to develop, because they will develop oral fluency at home. But that is based on BICS, which is the basic interpersonal communication skills. Those are the conversational languages that we use every day. We want to also focus on CALP, which is cognitive academic language proficiency, because that language they need in school if they're going to succeed in school. So we use the first language to help them gain the cognitive academic language that they need. So that's where the first language comes in. We don't necessarily need to recreate or create academic terms in the first language, unless the first language community really desires to do that. That's not necessary, but they need to be able to articulate, for example, what photosynthesis is, if they're going to understand, articulate it in their first language.
You also mentioned how crucial writing is in the teaching of MLE. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. When we write our thoughts in written form, then we're developing our cognition, okay? Because we have to formulate a thought, a whole thought. We have to figure out how to represent it in the written form. So that's a deep structure thinking skill. We can't do that in the second language until we have a certain level of mastery of the second language, and that takes a long time to get there. Right. So if we want to affect the way learners develop their deeper thinking skills, we get them to write their thoughts in their first language. And it's not that easy at first. It needs to start in preschool, where children are told, tell me a story. So tell me an oral story first. And then after they tell you the story in oral form, say, could you draw a picture of that story? So they start by drawing a picture which represents what they're thinking in their mind, and they move gradually until slowly they're using language, written language, to represent what they're thinking in their mind. If you just wait until they know their ABCs and they know how to write, you're bypassing a whole period where they could develop cognitively in terms of translating what they're thinking onto the paper. And it's a little bit easier for them to then represent their thoughts in written form. But when we bypass that altogether, which we did in the bilingual program, and we expect them to just write in English, it's like there's this barrier. Even for kids who can speak English, they can use English, it's still hard to put what they're thinking on paper. There's kind of a stigma there. So if we want to develop that, then start in the first language and start very, very early.
And this should remind teachers that writing is primarily a thinking activity.
That's right.
It's not just something that we do mechanically.
Right. And when they just focus on writing as penmanship, it's copy what's on the board into your notebook, or copy what's in the book into your notebook. And that's just focusing on shapes and forms and neatness. It's not necessarily getting them to imagine something and then represent that thing that they've imagined in written form, because they're copying someone else's imagination or someone else's thoughts rather than transferring their own thoughts.
You also mentioned earlier scaffolding. How do teachers do that?
When they're working, okay, so for example, if a teacher is teaching, a math lesson or something, and somebody doesn't get it, then usually the teacher will start again, and maybe that's when it's very crucial to have those manipulatives or those physical objects to use to show the processes. So that would be scaffolding the learning in that case. So when it's applied to language learning, when the teacher says something and then the child responds in the second language, but they can't produce the whole sentence in the second language, or maybe they can't produce anything in the second language, then the teacher works with them and provides for them maybe part or the whole response in the second language and then says, can you say that with me? Sometimes a student understands the question, can provide somewhat of a second language structured sentence, but they're missing a few words because they don't have those yet in the second language. So then the teacher can say, oh, what you mean is, and gives the full second language sentence, and then says, can you say that with me? So they're hearing the correct form, and then they're saying it. So that's scaffolding, that's helping them, rather than just saying, can somebody help them? That's another strategy teachers often use. Who can do it right? This fellow didn't do it right, but who can do it right? That's not helping, that's just testing. Who knows the right answer? Rather than doing that, just helping the child to hear, understand, and then produce the second language.